let's go back to traditional dualism and say take the Cartesian form, traditional Cartesian metaphysical dualism, and remember the way it worked. In outline, Descartes argued sort of as follows. He had a conception of the physical world. He gave a conception of physics. The conception of physics is what was called in those days the mechanical philosophy. Philosophy is just a word for science. So philosophy means science. So the mechanical philosophy meant mechanics. And mechanics was kind of a common sense mechanics. It was a sort of contact mechanics. Things can influence one another if they're in contact. That's the crucial idea. Like I can't move the moon by moving my arm, let's say, because they're not in contact. That's just common sense. It happens to be wrong, but it's common sense. Okay, so that's common sense contact mechanics. And Descartes gave a kind of, sketchy account. I mean, it's not a detailed account, but a sort of sketchy account of how you might cover all of the phenomena he claimed of the inorganic world, the organic world, most of things about humans, everything except these few things that I mentioned, in terms of the mechanical philosophy, in terms of a kind of contact mechanics. Well, all of that's, and then he said, look, here's these phenomena that are around, like the creative aspect of language use, which don't fall under this. Therefore, we need a new principle, completely rational. We need a new principle because they're not covered by the mechanical philosophy. Within his framework, the only way to set up a new principle was to introduce a new substance. But that's part of the framework with which he approached it. So you introduce res cogitans, another principle, thinking substance, which has other properties. And then from a naturalistic point of view, you have two questions. First of all, what's its character? What is it? What is the res cogitans? Nobody actually knows whether Descartes had an answer to this. If you look at his major book, the Traité du Monde, this big study of the world, there's only 3 volumes. There was a 4th volume which was supposedly devoted to the mind, and legend has it that he destroyed that volume after he heard what happened to Galileo. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. Maybe all the secrets are in there, like Fermat's last theorem or something. But in any event, there's nothing much around from the theory of mind. But that would have been the problem. One problem would have been, okay, if you've got this separate substance, tell us what it is. The second problem would be the standard unification problem that arises in the sciences altogether. That is, show how this theory relates to other theories. Now, in the terminology of that day, it meant solve the interaction problem, show how mind and body interact. That's the way in which the standard unification problem of normal science is stated in terms of a two-substance theory of the structure of science. And remember, a two-substance theory of science is perfectly rational. I mean, it may be completely wrong again, but most theories have always been wrong. There's nothing irrational about it. We can, I think, without doing serious violence to, in fact, maybe even providing some understanding to the history, rethink it in this form. So we have a naturalistic approach which claims to show that a whole range of phenomena of the world fall under contact mechanics, so it identifies some phenomena that don't fall into it, invokes a new principle, then should proceed to study that new principle, developing a theory of mind, which would be like a theory of chemistry or genes or something, and then solve the unification problem, show how it falls in with other parts of the theory of the world. And it looks as if that's what Descartes was trying to do in Principles of Philosophy and Traité du Monde and all that sort of stuff. These are the parts of Descartes that nobody ever reads. The parts of Descartes that people read are things like Discourse on Method, which was like a research grant proposal. I mean, it wasn't serious. He was saying, look, support me, I want to work on this topic. Or the Meditations, where he's trying to answer questions that philosophers raised about all this. But from Descartes' point of view, as much as you can reconstruct, it seems that what was important was the science, dioptrics, things like that. And the other stuff was thinking about the nature of the science. Well, since the science is mostly, in fact, almost all, maybe all, outmoded, you don't study it. But for that matter, nobody much studies Galileo either, because it's done differently and better. But that doesn't mean that it wasn't important to him, you know. What remains is the talk about the science. And since there's been no progress in that at all, you can make perfectly good sense to read, say, Discourse on Method. But I think one should read it recognizing that for Descartes, this is peripheral. It's not central. If you want to understand the project, you have to look at it his way. When you reconstruct it his way, I think you find a very naturalistic project, which ends up with metaphysical dualism as a serious proposal about the nature of the world, which could very well turn out to be right, like other serious proposals about the nature of the world. Well, so again, this is dualism, but it's not non-naturalistic. It's naturalistic dualism. Maybe wrong, but naturalistic within the spirit of science. Well, all of this has been ridiculed, especially in the modern period, as the idea that there's, as Gilbert Ryle put it, a ghost in the machine, and then you're supposed to laugh. There's a ghost in the machine. Isn't that silly? But that mistakes the problem completely. It's true that Cartesian metaphysical dualism didn't outlast the century, but it was not because of problems with the ghost. The theory of mind, such as it was untouched. What Newton exorcised was the machine, not the ghost. In fact, what Newton showed is, contrary to everyone's expectations, including his, you had a ghost all the way down. That is, even ordinary matter and the most elementary dynamics had ghostly properties. It wasn't just the mind. Everything is ghostly. So Newton showed that contact mechanics amazingly just didn't work. It was true that you could influence things at a distance. Now Newton, scientists of the day, including Newton incidentally, thought that this was absurd. Newton himself called universal gravitation an occult property. He said anyone with any brains at all can see that it's inconceivable that something can influence something that it's not in direct contact with. Yet we seem to have to assume that. Well, now, from his point of view, I mean, some major scientists of the day, people like, say, Huygens and others, just threw it out for this reason because it was idiotic. Newton was himself torn by it, you know. He realized that it's just got to be right because it was such a spectacular breakthrough. On the other hand, it made absolutely no sense because it was inconsistent with the mechanical philosophy. And what in fact happened is he didn't get rid of the ghost in the machine, but he just showed that all properties of matter are ghostly. It's all a ghost. You know, it's all unintelligible, all the way down to terrestrial motion and planetary motion, which is a big problem and remains a big problem. And it led to a totally new way of looking at science. This has been pointed out repeatedly. Bernard Cohen, who's maybe the major Newton scholar, points out, I'll just quote his version of it. He said by entering into this paradoxical world, he said Newton set forth a new view of science in which the goal is to find the best theoretical explanation, irrespective of any intuitive notion we may have of ultimate explanation. So the point is there is a ghost in the machine, and that's just the way the machines are. They're ghostly. Can't do anything about it. The mechanical philosophy appears to be wrong. Although it's self-evidently true, it just seems to be wrong. From this point on, we must find his quote. We must be satisfied with universal gravitation. Let's call it UG for short. I'll come back to that. We must be satisfied with UG and that it exists, even if we cannot explain it in terms of the self-evident mechanical philosophy. That's just where we are. Science means accepting UG if you have evidence for it, and it provides you with an intelligible scientific theory, even if there's no way of accounting for it in terms of what's self-evident, namely the mechanical philosophy, which you just have to admit is wrong, even though it's self-evidently true. From this point on, people's intuitions about what must be true become irrelevant. They just become irrelevant. So if the way to deal with universal gravitation is through curved space-time, okay. If the way to deal with the universe is through weird quantum mechanical effects, too bad for intuition. If the world really is made up of infinite one-dimensional strings in 10-dimensional space, okay, gotta stuck with that. Time has a beginning, fine, time has a beginning. And whatever lunatic idea people come up with tomorrow has to be evaluated in its own merits. Does it yield insight and understanding? Does it help us come to terms with the nature of the world? If it does, it satisfies the conditions for rational inquiry, irrespective of our intuitions. The Newtonian revolution, in fact, even earlier, the Galilean revolution, I think that's its essential content. Its kind of general content is sort of that. From then on, you're off on a totally new path. That's why it's really the one real scientific revolution in human history. It just set inquiry off on an entirely new path, and that's where we are. We have no other criteria. Common sense criteria are irrelevant. Now, we can't get out of our skins. I mean, you go out in the evening and you see the sun set, and no matter what you know, you still see the sun set. And when you see the moon near the horizon, it's just bigger than when you see it up there. You can't not see the moon illusion. So we see the world in terms of the way we are. Can't help it. Just like we intuitively feel that the mechanical philosophy must be true, because how could it not be? But we have come to recognize that the way we see the world is just another fact to be explained about the world. So if we see the sun set and we see the moon illusion and we believe in the mechanical philosophy, no matter how much we try not to, that's just a fact about the world. In fact, it's a fact about a very special part of the world, namely the human mind-brain, and the way in which it acts and conceptualizes and constructs and so on, and we'd like to come to understand that. And in order to do it, we have to make a kind of an intellectual wrench. We have to take ourselves out of our skins and look back at ourselves kind of reflexively as part of the world. And that's hard, but that's what it means to take to study human beings naturalistically. So that's the move one has to make, to study human beings naturalistically. And then the way we look at things in common sense no longer provides a criterion for intelligible explanation, but rather is just a phenomenon to be explained. Now, there's a real problem here, which you can see right off. Whatever the working notion of intelligible explanation is again something that's inside our skins, and we're stuck with that. That's something like a real paradox. We can only, whatever our capacities to carry out rational inquiry may be, say some corner of our brain, which let's just call it the science-forming faculty to dignify ignorance with a title, but there's some part of our brain that enables us to carry out rational inquiry, and it uses its own resources and its own criteria, which may be as misleading as the moon illusion. Maybe it's always systematically leading us away from the nature of the world. If we're creatures of the world, that would not be in the least surprising. But there we can't do anything about it, because we're stuck with those. That's as deep as you can go. You can't go beyond those. So if we're systematically misled about the world because of the way our science-forming faculty happens to be constructed, that we can't do much about. But we can overcome the moon illusion. It's hard, but we can overcome it. We can't stop seeing it. Can't stop seeing the sun setting. You can't stop believing in the mechanical philosophy. Newton's intuitions are, at least my intuitions, but that part you can throw out. The part that's guiding our search for intelligible theory, we can't throw out. There's no way to get out of that. And there you are approaching something which is kind of like classical paradox, maybe. But we have to recognize from the naturalistic point of view that we are just a particular organism trying to understand the world, and we've got to do it our way because there is no other possibility. Well, so anyway, with getting past through metaphysical dualism, we've now abandoned metaphysical dualism, but abandoned it in a very special way. It's not that there's a ghost in the machine. It's that the machine has ghostly properties all the way. Maybe it has even more ghostly properties above the neck. If so, okay, but that's just another fact. However, it's already unintelligible to common sense down to elementary dynamics. That's been Newton's basic discovery. That's why contemporary discussion ridiculing the ghost in the machine is completely off track, in my opinion. It's just missing the point of what happened. There was no criticism made of the Cartesian theory of mind. You could argue that's because it wasn't substantive enough, maybe. But in any event, it survived all of this intact, such as it was. What did not survive is the theory of the machine. Contact mechanics was thrown out. And the common sense of the next scientific generation is that the mechanical philosophy is wrong. Actually, it took a long time for this to settle in. For a couple hundred years in physics, people were trying to find mechanical explanations. And it really wasn't until probably the 20th century that was given up. You get as late as people like Poincaré. He was arguing that the molecular theory of gases we adopt only because as a computing mechanism. And the only reason we adopt it is because we're familiar with the game of billiards. So it's kind of convenient computing mechanism. And efforts to try to explain things in terms of, ether and stuff like that are an attempt to carry out mechanical philosophy. And it was a long time before. It was really this century before Newton's insight was basically incorporated into the sciences. And it's harder maybe even to do it in the emerging sciences. But anyhow, I think in retrospect, that's the way we have to look at it. Well, if this is correct, then so I'm being kind of anachronistic when I say that the 17th century exorcised mechanical philosophy. It did in principle. It didn't yet do it in fact. It left a big residue of unhappiness and confusion that took centuries to sort out. But looking back, it seems fair to say, abstractly speaking, that Newton exorcised the machine. He got rid of the mechanical philosophy. Footnote, it's an anachronism to say it that way, but I think an accurate historical reconstruction. And I'll continue with historical reconstruction. Well, one consequence of eliminating the machine is that we've gotten rid of any notion of body or physical or material. There no longer is any notion of the material world. Remember, Descartes could be a dualist because he had a notion of body. Body, not a very clear notion, but at least a general notion. Body is defined by the mechanical philosophy, by contact mechanics. That's body. Okay. Now, Newton showed that's not the way body works. So therefore, we have no conception of body. In fact, there's just a world, whatever it is. If the world has mental properties, that's part of the world. But there is no notion of body. Unless somebody comes up with a new notion, and nobody's ever done that, unless somebody comes up with a new notion of the physical, talk about physicalism or materialism or eliminative materialism or the mind-body problem and so on, just seems to be meaningless. Now, if this is correct, something very curious has happened because people are talking about it all the time. There's all kind of stuff right up to the present about the mind-body problem. And there are theories in the cognitive sciences, say the church ones, called eliminative materialism, which says we shouldn't study the mind, we should just study the material world. And there's a lot of questions about physicalist reductionism. Can we reduce things to physical terms? In fact, this is universal in philosophy in these areas. But I don't understand it. Maybe nobody can explain it to me. It seems that once we have lost the notion of physical, none of this discussion is even meaningful. It doesn't mean anything. You can't have a problem of reducing things to the material if there's no notion of material. And there is no notion of material. What is it? I mean, somebody could say, well, it's what they teach over in the physics department. But the people in the physics department tell you that's not true, because they expect 2 years from now to be teaching something else, at least if the subject's still alive. So that can't be true. And there is no other notion. All we have is the world with whatever properties it has. There's no notion of material world or physical world. Hence, all of the problems of reduction have disappeared. The problems of elimination of study the mind in favor of neurophysiology or something don't mean anything. They're just purely irrational statements saying instead of studying this part of the world, let's study that part of the world, if you want to. But that doesn't make any more sense than saying since solids are hard to study, let's study liquids. Maybe okay, but it's of no more interest than that. Unless somebody can come along with a theory, with a concept of the material to replace the Cartesian concept, which has been thrown out the window. And as far as I know, nobody has even addressed that problem, let alone offered an answer to it. And if so, again, let me try to put it in the strongest terms, virtually all the discussion in the field is not just wrong, but meaningless, literally without meaning. It's talking about a problem that's unstatable. That's the strongest version of the position I'm trying to take. So let me put it in the most outrageous form possible. The whole field is not wrong, but meaningless, talking about something that it can't characterize, namely something that presupposes a notion of physical which has been abandoned since the 17th century. That's the strongest version of this particular thesis. Well, with metaphysical dualism now unstatable, because we don't have any body anymore, notions like eliminative materialism and so on lose sense, and the kind of natural conclusion to draw from Newton's demolition of the theory of matter, and that's what it was, is to, the natural conclusion is to say that human thought and action, say creative aspect of language use, are just properties of organized matter, because that's all there is, there's nothing else, so they're just properties of organized matter. And in fact, that conclusion was drawn sporadically, but not too long after. It was drawn first by Lamettrie, then it was about a century later, half a century later, and it was considered totally outrageous. In fact, his work hasn't been revived until this century. Lamettrie was driven out, he was a doctor, and his argument was, look, thought must be just a property of organized matter, because there isn't anything else. He was driven out of France, driven out of Holland. He finally survived thanks to the protection of Frederick the Great for some reason. About a generation later, in more tolerant England, the same idea was developed by the eminent chemist Joseph Priestley, a major 18th century scientist, who argued that, let's see if I can find his quotes, he argued, I'm quoting him now, that thought in humans is a property of the brain. It's the necessary result of a certain organization. It's like electricity and magnetism and the powers of attraction and repulsion. That's what he compared it to. Nobody really understood those things. But whatever electricity, magnetism, and the powers of attraction and repulsion are, these ghostly properties that matter has, thought is just another one of them. It's another one of those ghostly properties. And we have to investigate it in these terms. Another 18th century version is that the brain secretes thought the way the liver secretes bile. That's kind of the image. Actually, if you look at people like John Searle today, he seems to be saying something more or less similar to that, if I understand him correctly. Well, that looks like the right move, mainly because there's no other choice. There doesn't seem to be any other move you could make. I mean, since all there is a world which has ghostly properties all the way down to elementary dynamics, there's nothing to say except that properties of attraction, repulsion, and electricity, and magnetism, and later on quantum effects, and thought, and whatever else is around, anything that's going on, is just some property of the world, some property of the way matter is organized, where matter now has no meaning. It's just whatever there is. Some property of how whatever there is organized has these features. And a naturalistic approach to humans ought to proceed that way. Well, that leads us to the next question. How can organized matter have these properties? Well, on that question, progress has been essentially zero. We don't know we have nothing to say about how organized matter can have such properties as the creative aspect of language use. In that respect, we're exactly as much in the dark as the Cartesians were. It's not that matter and mind are different kinds of things. That can't be, because there doesn't seem to be any such kind of thing as matter. So therefore, matter and mind can't be different kinds of things, there being no matter. So they're not different kinds of things, but if we think of those terms as descriptive conveniences, describing certain aspects of the world, namely humans above the neck versus everything else, then it seems that matter and mind pose different kinds of problems to human intelligence. That appears to be the case. Maybe they'll be shown to be wrong, like there was a time when electricity and magnetism, and for that matter universal gravitation, also posed total mysteries. And maybe we just haven't learned enough. But for now, it seems reasonable to suppose that matter and mind, though not different kind of things, do pose different kind of problems to human intelligence.